So, this weekend I finally finished Stellar Blade. And to be honest, I didn't love it by the time I was done. While I know I'm pretty late to the party with this one, I've been wanting to talk about this game as I'm feeling somewhat conflicted. My thoughts on this game are a lot more complicated than I anticipated they would be when I first started playing it almost a month ago now. And so I'm hoping that making this video today will help me to solidify how I feel about Stellar Blade one way or the other. Because on the surface, I think it's a great game. It's fun, it's polished, and it's of an indisputably high quality in many ways. Of course, the game's combat is its main selling point, and it really is fantastic. It's fast, it's fluid, it's satisfying with the stylish theatricality of something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, great company to keep in this particular genre. And yet, despite all of that, I think Stellar Blade is missing something pretty vital. Something that prevented me from truly loving and connecting with the game, and kept me from ever feeling genuinely invested in the adventure, even some 50 hours later. It feels like there is an inescapable black hole gnawing away at the centre of this otherwise great game, and it is a great game, make no mistake. When I say I didn't love it, that's the realization I came to after a full set of 2 playthroughs, completing absolutely everything to get the Platinum Trophy in the end. And by the way, I can't stand it when a game forces you to run through a second playthrough to get the Platinum, but that's not germane to this discussion today. And while it feels like it took me a long time to get through the game, and I was pretty relieved to be done by the end of that second playthrough specifically, that isn't necessarily indicative of the way I felt about the game itself. After all, its baseline quality is objectively high, I'd argue. Instead, it's more to do with how shockingly robust Stellar Blade actually is. There is so much to do here, and finishing a city's worth of side quests and trying to get every single fish in the game takes a surprisingly long time. Of course, Stellar Blade isn't the only game I've been playing either. Marvel Rivals is still eating up a lot of my time after all, but otherwise my sole single-player focus has been this. Well, I think I'm finally in a good spot to talk about it. And so in today's video, I want to discuss what I think Stellar Blade is missing, what crucial ingredient the game lacked that kept me from loving it, despite having an otherwise good time with it. But I also want to, in that same vein, highlight the parts of the game that I did really like too, as it has plenty going for it. But that's not all. I'd also like to detail why I'm okay with not loving it, why the game doesn't need to be that for me at all, and to be honest, why after 50 hours, I'm pretty content with where the game landed for me when all was said and done. Now, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already if you enjoyed this video to stay up to date with everything coming out of the channel, and thank you so very much as we did hit 10,000 subscribers, and I really appreciate the support in helping to get this channel off the ground. To be honest, whether you're subscribed or not, I'm just thankful you're here at all, so let's get on with this thing. Okay, so let's start with my overall thoughts on Stellar Blade itself. What I liked about the game after spending 50 or so hours with it. Now, I'm not going to go incredibly in-depth here as I'm aware the game has been out for almost 12 months now, but I want to reiterate from the get-go that I do think this is a good game, a great game even. It's really fun to simply exist in the world of Stellar Blade, killing enemies and carving up towering bosses. Mechanically, the game is very tight and exceptionally well made. Crucially, perhaps above all else, it feels like a big achievement, and an even bigger win for Shift Up, who was essentially just a mobile developer before this, most famous for the game Goddess of Victory Nikki. But thanks to Stellar Blade and how well the game turned out, they've really exploded onto the scene in a big way. Stellar Blade itself feels like a statement of intent from the studio, like them laying the groundwork of a new path before them. The game feels like they're saying, look at us, we're confident, we're competent, and we can go shoulder to shoulder with the big boys right out of the gate. And I think they've absolutely done that. They've showcased that ability almost immediately here. And it's also another big win, another big success story for South Korean game development. It feels similar to the success experienced by Lies of P, a game that I did ultimately prefer to this one, but they both made tremendous splashes when they arrived on the scene. These two games marked really effective console debuts for these developers, transforming them into someone worth paying attention to in the overcrowded AAA console space almost overnight. And that's no small feat. But getting back to the game itself, like I said at the outset, there is a lot to like about it, and there was a lot that I liked about it. It makes sense to start with the combat, because without a doubt that is the strongest element of the game. In Stellar Blade, the combat is the game. It's at the very core of what you'll be doing, of how you experience the world, and how you reach out and interact with it. Eve herself feels incredibly strong, and her blade, the Blood Edge, is an extension of your reach. When you're in the midst of a heated battle and everything clicks into place, it really does feel exquisite at times. While the game does have Souls-like elements to it, for example resting at supply camps to restore your health and items, with the trade-off of course being that every enemy you previously killed is resurrected, it refuses to be bound by the traditional Souls-like feel. Instead, this is a character action game first and foremost, and feels much more akin to the likes of Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and even more in the hack and slash realm of something like Ninja Gaiden. There's no question about it, no illusion of weakness here. Eve is a powerful acrobatic warrior with immense skill, and you do feel like you're wielding that expertise at your fingertips. Interestingly, within the wider realm of Souls-likes, it feels like we are experiencing a shift lately in game design away from the more methodical, slower-paced combat of Dark Souls, and even away from the fast, aggressive, risk-reward nature of Bloodborne, and moving instead towards a more controlled, balanced, and yes, rhythmic style akin to Sekiro, with a real focus on successful parrying above all else, turning most fights into delicate dances of death, wherein you need to be nailing the timing of your button presses to succeed. Parrying has become an absolute mainstay staple of combat within many of these highly regarded Souls-likes in recent years. When Lies of P first came out, there was some despair from corners of the community that yes, it seemed to be prioritizing Sekiro's focus on perfect parrying in order to break the stance of your enemies, and the same is true here, and seemingly true as well in the upcoming first Berserker Kazan, which we recently had a look at on the channel as well. Being required to face down a menacing, often lightning-fast boss without the security of a shield or the reliability of a quick-step dodge means this style of combat has a much higher skill ceiling in some regards than the others, and I think when presented in such an upfront manner, has the highest likelihood of turning players away, new players away, when they struggle to grasp it. But ultimately, while Stellar Blade does incorporate parrying and perfect parrying into its combat in a big way, it never felt unforgiving to me. In fact, I'd argue the opposite. Stellar Blade's perfect parry system is quite generous, especially as you unlock new skills further into the game that make both perfect parries and perfect dodges even easier to pull off. This is absolutely a more accessible game than your traditional Souls-like, I'd say, and there's an emphasis here on looking cool, on the rule of cool, and being able to pull off impressive moves without too much trouble. But pulling off one or a string of perfect parries in the heat of battle against a ferocious, overwhelming boss really does feel incredible as you hit the button at the exact right time and weapons lock in an explosion of gold sparks and an accompanying crack of lightning streaks across the screen. Having successfully protected yourself from the boss's onslaught, it's now your turn to return the favour, following up the parries with a flash of blue and white as you unleash a well-placed beta energy strike to force the enemy into a corner, or an arc of crimson as you demolish them in a single palpable blow with a burst attack. It all comes together extremely well on the field of battle. The combat does feel almost like a dance, a rhythmic procession of well-timed button presses in conjunction with identifying and reacting to the different colours that explode into life on screen as the enemy winds up for another attack. Understanding what each of the colours corresponds to is key to understanding the flow of battle. Whether it's yellow, whether it's blue, whether it's a purple flash, that means you're able to leap upwards into the air and plant a double kick into the enemy's chest, putting some distance between the two of you. The options on offer here to allow you to approach combat however you like are extensive. Whether you prefer to prioritise close quarters melee combat or utilise your drone for a more ranged offensive, there's a lot going on. And as you start to master the various systems, the game really comes together in a way that's absolutely satisfying to play. But Stellar Blade impressed me in other ways too. The visuals are nearly impeccable for the most part, presenting one of the cleanest looking experiences on console right now. This is a game that really takes advantage of the PS5 Pro, and performance was excellent and silky smooth throughout, save for one area late into the game where the frame rate began to chug and dip a little bit during some of the heavier sequences. I played the game on the Pro setting, not Pro Max. I did what I was told by Digital Foundry, you see, and it seemed to work out absolutely fine for me. So on a technical level, this is a very impressive looking game. Character models are also stunning. Some of these character faces might be the best I've ever seen in a video game, with the character of Adam in particular really standing out to me as just having one of the most realistic looking human faces I've ever seen, outside of something like Death Stranding perhaps. The landscapes often look immaculate and well presented too, though I did notice a lot of large, low-resolution textures on some of the rock faces and cliff sides, for instance, particularly in the more open-ended zones like the wasteland or the Great Desert, almost as though they never expected players to visit some of these particular spots even though they are pretty exposed and out in the open. But that aside, this is a game that prioritizes presentation. It looks great, it sounds great, and it plays great. On the surface then, Stellar Blade is a real winner, particularly for a studio's first outing. In a recent video of mine, where I discussed my favourite games of 2024, I noted that the year felt defined in many respects by games that harkened back to a bygone era of gaming, where gameplay was the core focus above all else, helping to create these lean experiences. 2024 was dominated by a return to form in some sense, with many of these types of games ruling the roost in a vacuum created by a less than stellar, no pun intended, output by a lot of the big publishers across the last 12 months. Games like Stellar Blade, like Astrobot, like Black Myth Wukong that do prioritise a gameplay-first experience while eschewing much of the nonsense that has seeped into games over the last decade or so, are seemingly desperately trying to pull the industry back from the brink, and I think it's working to some degree. Certainly it's being taken notice of. In my opinion then, that's perhaps the best thing I can say about Stellar Blade. It knows what it is. It has zero baggage whatsoever, presenting the player with a lean, laser-focused experience, and that's great. So that all sounds pretty good to me, right? That's a fairly hefty heaping of praise, and like I said, the game is good. I enjoyed my time with it, I wouldn't have platinumed it if I didn't. So why then did I come away from Stellar Blade with a strangely conflicting feeling? Why did I come away from my time with the game enjoying what I did, but lamenting a somewhat superfluous and hollow feeling experience? Why didn't I love it? The issue for me lies not so much in how the game presents itself at a surface level, but what exists underneath. It's a very good, very competent, very serviceable action game, and thanks to that I had plenty of fun. But at least from my perspective, it doesn't really go any deeper than that. As a result, I feel Stellar Blade is unlikely to stick with me in a meaningful way long term. Because as I've discussed, while I think on a technical level, on a surface level, the game's presentation is strong, It's in the art direction and the overall design that it falters and becomes something lesser than its peers. I feel like there are a couple of games that Stellar Blade pretty obviously takes inspiration from, as I mentioned earlier, that also make great comparison points. Devil May Cry and Bayonetta have both been previously mentioned in this video, and for good reason. But this time I want to turn those comparisons on their head. Stellar Blade has all of the flash and the style of a Devil May Cry game, right down to the high-octane, over-the-top cinematics, wherein the main character performs absurd acrobatics in the middle of a fight in a very stylish way, but it stops short right there. It has the flash and the style, but none of the pomp and the circumstance, none of the self-aware flamboyance that elevates those titles to the next level, and perhaps most crucially of all, none of the charm. It's almost robotic in its approach, which may very well be the point, considering the game's context. There's a strange dissonance, though, to be found between the incredibly self-serious nature of Stellar Blade's story and world, and the way some of the story is presented, from the characters to the shifts in tone found throughout. While just a cute little quirk, ostensibly Eve finding soda cans throughout the world and then randomly displaying them like an Instagram influencer or something does feel a little bit jarring. But I mean, that is really a tiny little thing. Instead, let's go back to one of the elements that I praised the absolute most, because it's also one of the areas that I have the biggest issue with: the visuals. Again, I think on a technical level, the visuals of Stellar Blade are absolutely amazing. They are very, very strong, and present a truly confident, outward-facing image. But again, I think they are almost universally lacking in character and charm, to the point where it's almost completely absent in places. Eve herself is perhaps the only character in this game with a truly memorable design that actually has any real impact, any real significance. And maybe that's all that matters, since she is the main character. But putting her aside for the moment, I don't expect to remember really any of this cast within the next year or so. Lily, Adam, the characters from Zion itself are all pretty bland and generic. And sadly, the characters with the strongest, most evocative designs in the game don't really get anything to do. Whether that's the leader of Zion, Orkul, who has a great layered look, to his samurai bodyguard, who literally does nothing until he gets off-screened by an enemy at the end of the game, to Roxanne, the city's info dealer. These are the most compelling characters in the game, and none of them really do anything at all, and again, there's very little in the way of charm to be found here. I was sure on my first playthrough that both Orkul and his bodyguard would turn out to be bosses, but really nothing was done with their fantastic designs. And again, I don't want to stray from the fact that maybe that's the point here. After all, the game's setting is a long deserted Earth after the remnants of humanity lost this terrible apocalyptic war, and so what you're left with is a corpse of a planet, an empty shell, dried up and spat back out again, left to have its bones picked apart by the monsters that now freely roam it. And let's talk about those monsters, the enemies in this game, the Naytiba, because they're another element that I feel is so emblematic of the game's core struggle, this juxtaposition found at the heart of it, that inability to just go the distance. Like the visuals before them, the Naytiba work on many levels as great enemies within the game. The enemy design itself is really strong here. These are horrifying, alien-like abominations with writhing tentacles, putrid forms, and vicious weaponry to combat. And perhaps more importantly than that, there's a ton of variety here. Each area in the game has brand new Naytiba to face off against, highlighting that variety on offer. But they lack refinement. They lack finesse, and you might be thinking, well, obviously they do, they are this strange race of bloodthirsty monsters, but they lack, again, character. The monsters in this game, for as varied and well designed as they are, feel generic, even though their backstory, their history is actually quite interesting. They feel like faceless forms that I'll have forgotten in a few months. There's nothing truly memorable about them at all, for as effective as they are, and I find that to be kind of strange. Bloodborne is my favourite game of all time, so maybe this isn't fair, but even now I can recall so many of just the game's basic enemy types, because they all have an impact in one way or another. Whether it's the basic Yarnamites that scream at you to get away while waving their pitchforks and flame torches, terrified of you, thinking that you're the beast, to the ghoulish, ghost-faced men with lanterns and wide-rimmed hats that silently patrol the misty winding paths of the cathedral ward, to of course the weirder creatures of the night. The brain suckers who hide crouched in their hooded tunics, to the scholars of Bergenworth, long transformed into flies. Every enemy is so well defined, so memorable. In fact, Bloodborne is not a fair comparison, so let's look at another game I've mentioned in this video already, Lies of P. The basic enemies in that game have so much character, whether it's the deranged night watchman puppets patrolling the streets like mad constables swinging their batons in an erratic fashion, to the operatic spider women found later in the game, to the creepy circus clowns that unleash their extendo fists and spin towards you. It feels like the game is constantly throwing new enemies at you that require you to take a different approach each time, drilling them into your brain, while the Naytiba of Stellar Blade are all taken down in the same way. And yeah, maybe that's because, in its underlying formula, Stellar Blade is inherently more a hack and slash akin to the likes of Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, than it is a traditional Souls-like. Rather than picking and choosing your battles carefully, self-preservation feels like less of a priority here, and you can charge into battle much more freely. The sense of danger isn't as palpable because you are inherently more powerful. And so the game finds itself caught in a fascinating in-between. But okay, let's get back on track. The way you fight enemies in this game is not the issue, but the character and charm, or lack thereof, of the enemies is. And that speaks to the wider problem within Stellar Blade, the main reason I wasn't able to fall in love with the game, and why I wasn't truly invested in my adventure come the end. Stellar Blade is missing a sense of wonder. If we compare this game to Souls and Souls-likes again, then it's clear where it falls short almost immediately. For as much as those games are about ruthlessly difficult boss battles and incredibly challenging gameplay, they are just as much about exploration and getting lost within an immaculately designed world, drinking it all in, the shortcuts, the different pathways, the secrets. In the same way, those games reward you with your next boss fight, they also reward you with stunning vistas around certain corners, incredible, tantalizing worlds, and then they litter those worlds with mysterious, nuanced characters. Stellar Blade doesn't really have any of that. It's missing that sense of wonder that entices you to go explore, that takes your hand and guides you from the beaten path, imploring you to get lost within its world. I mean, there are so many instances of a Souls or a Souls-like game opening up for the player and then presenting them with a truly captivating looking landscape ripe for exploration, and you can't wait to just dive in and discover its secrets. And this is even before Elden Ring came around with its open world, open-ended design. Again, these are only a few cherry-picked examples, but in Bloodborne, when you first arrive in Old Yharnam and you can see much of the area spread out before you, it looks foreboding and ominous, and while it may be mostly linear, the simple fact of the way it looks is enough to make you want to get stuck in. The same goes for the arrival into Fountainhead Palace in Sekiro, with it laid bare before you and that beauty, that expanse being shown off for the first time, that sense of wonder kicks in. Lane St. Frangelico's Cathedral in Lies of P, High Wall of Lothric, and so on. In fact, this is a similar issue that I found in the demo of the first Berserker Kazan. Uninspired and bland art direction that stifled the overall desire to explore. And art direction does play an enormous role in creating this sense of wonder, this desire to see more. Black Myth Wukong's art direction is genuinely superb, a truly inspired work of pure creativity and mythology. In Black Myth Wukong, you want to explore these lands before you. The issue with that game was that the actual act of exploration turned out to be not all that satisfying or fun, for me at least. Combining the two and nailing them down is a delicate tightrope walk, and only something the From Software games succeed at virtually every single time. Give players that sense of wonder, that desire to explore your fantastical worlds that you've finally crafted, and then make the actual act of exploration worthwhile and fun. That's where the challenge is, achieving and seamlessly marrying those two, and I don't think Stellar Blade succeeds in at least one of those areas. Compounding this idea is the simple fact that Stellar Blade failed to create a truly enticing world, and it's perhaps the game's biggest, most consequential failing for me. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I think the game is completely uninspired in its art direction, because that's just not fair, but I do think the game world specifically is pretty dull and not particularly rewarding to explore. That sense of wonder that I keep talking about, the main ingredient missing here, has to be facilitated, it has to be born out of something, and in Stellar Blade it drains away when you see that the landscape sprawling out sometimes endlessly in front of you just isn't all that special, all that interesting or enticing. You don't really get those moments I mentioned earlier, those rewards where the reward is the world itself, where you just want to sit there and take it all in. I mean, you absolutely do sometimes, very occasionally, such as when you see the orbital elevator up close for the first time. But for the most part, it is a wholly uninteresting world, devoid of intrigue. A lot of the zones and areas in Stellar Blade look and feel very similar to explore, and again, this wouldn't be an issue if that look and feel was genuinely interesting from the get-go. IDOS 7 is a perfectly serviceable opening area, placing you within a dilapidated city as the rain lashes down, creating a somber atmosphere. Signs of life and greenery cling to the fallen buildings as monsters stalk the streets, shattered cars and other hallmarks of humanity lingering in an endless expanse of time as the world reclaims itself. It's cool and well presented technically, but I mean, I can't help but think I've seen it all before. As you continue through the city, well, much of it looks the same. You might find a parking lot, or a construction site, maybe even a sewer, but that's about as interesting as it gets. Maybe it's just the fact that it's Earth that dampens the luster for me. Sure, it's a dramatically altered Earth, but it is Earth all the same, filled with that familiar iconography, those familiar landmarks, filled with highways and high rises, and traffic lights and so many things associated with normalcy. Where is the illustrious moonlit glow of the city of Irithyll, or the immense cathedrals that inspire awe of Anor Londo? Again, I get it. Perhaps some of these comparisons aren't fair. Perhaps some of this is unavoidable. Stellar Blade is much more firmly rooted in the genre of sci-fi, where of course most of From Software's games are in the fantasy realm. They're two totally different things. So maybe this is on me. Maybe I just have an inherent preference for the fantasy setting. However, perhaps the most egregious offender, in my opinion, was the game's two biggest zones, the ones that are designed to be open-ended, unlike the more linear paths of the likes of IDOS 7. The Wasteland, which is the game's second major zone, and the Great Desert, the fourth major zone, may as well be the same place. They are giant, sprawling spaces, but they look and feel incredibly similar. They're ultimately both just big, orange sandboxes filled with a whole lot of nothing. As the name suggests, the Great Desert is made up of sand dunes, which I guess is kind of cool, while the Wasteland has more of a canyon vibe. But when you are running from point to point across a mostly flat and open expanse, they feel very similar. They look similar, they feel similar, and as the game's two biggest zones, they do get boring after a while. There's none of the inherent intrigue found in even other games' worst or most lacking areas. Here, you can stand at one section of the map, look out across that vast, rusty plain, and what you see is very much what you get. Surprises are few and far between. Stellar Blade really struggles to turn its world into something worth traversing, and that diminishes the desire for exploration and the sense of wonder that really attaches you to the world. The Great Desert makes sense as it is, but the Wasteland could have really been anything else. What about an irradiated hellscape, the site of a massive former battle where the world itself is torn asunder, and a sickly green glow now emanates from beneath the blackened land at all times, perhaps the one area of Earth that is no longer salvageable? Or even something a lot simpler, a snowscape. There's a tiny bit of snow at the start of the Spire 4 zone, and frankly it's the most interesting and varied landscape in the game. Speaking of Spire 4, that area and the orbital elevator at the centre were my favourite areas of the game, even though they were quite linear. At the very least, they were striking in their design. Perhaps as a result of the world being so devoid of intrigue, Stellar Blade's story didn't manage to capture me either. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe my lack of interest in the story exacerbated my feelings towards the setting. Ultimately, the story in these kinds of games is, generally speaking, the least important part. Again, Souls games often avoid giving you a complete narrative in the first place, forcing you instead to piece it together through item descriptions and environmental storytelling, so at least Stellar Blade is trying to offer a cohesive narrative, and again, in that sense, it is much more akin to the likes of Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, once again flirting between the boundaries of a Souls-like and a more traditional hack and slash. But it's all part of the same wider issue. The world, the characters, the narrative all lack charm and spice and intrigue, completely carving out that sense of wonder and removing the desire to explore. And it's a shame too, as Stellar Blade does have some interesting themes, and it is definitely trying to convey something with them. But I've come to the realization that Stellar Blade is actually in an interesting place right now. At least in my estimation, the franchise can only really go up from here, and not because, again, I think this game is bad, but because I think it's already nailed what is probably the hardest and certainly the most vital part to get right, the gameplay itself. The gameplay here feels incredible, and that is what kept me playing for so long. It's just that everything around it, everything the gameplay comes packaged within, left me feeling uninspired, left me uninvested in the world itself, and that's absolutely something they can build on. If the fundamentals of the gameplay itself were broken, there'd be no hope whatsoever. And I want there to be hope, because I really did enjoy my time with the game. This video makes it sound like nothing but doom and gloom, but nothing could be further from the truth. It's just the artistic presentation, not the technical presentation, but the artistic presentation that left me wanting. And so that's why I didn't love Stellar Blade. It's missing a sense of wonder, of whimsy, born out of an art direction capable of pushing and selling those ideas, that makes the player want to see all that the world has to offer. Stellar Blade's biggest issue was that it failed to draw me into its world. What kept me playing was the gameplay, and maybe that's all you can really ask for at the end of the day, but as a result, it means it's a game that I only really enjoyed at a surface level, despite trying to engage with it in a deeper way. For a first try though, this is incredible work, and I'm excited to see what's next for the series. I believe a sequel is supposed to be in the works already, so I'll be curious to see what form it takes. And before we wrap up here, I want to briefly discuss why I'm absolutely okay with this being my takeaway from the time spent with Stellar Blade. I've told you all of this today to give you my thoughts on the game, but actually I don't think any of this is inherently a bad thing. To me, Stellar Blade isn't exceptional. It doesn't really stand out, and I likely won't remember much of it within a year, and that's okay with me. Not every game has to be the new best thing, the new favourite, but in today's world it feels like there is a pressure to capture the zeitgeist, to be the new biggest thing every single time. It does feel like we, both as individuals and an industry, are always chasing that next big thing, more so than it's ever really felt in the past, and I think that makes complete sense with the way things are now. Games take so long to come out, and are often huge investments themselves. They are taking up so much of our time, so it's only natural to want to see nothing but the best in all of them, as each game played represents an opportunity cost where you could have played another. And that's why I'm happy with Stellar Blade being just perfectly good. It didn't blow me away, and I didn't love it, but I liked it, and that's fine. Not every game needs to be the next Elden Ring for me, and frankly that would be completely unsustainable. So, for me at least, Stellar Blade slots in nicely as a game that I was happy to play and am happy to be done with now. It wasn't a transformative experience, nor did it need to be. And of course, crucially, the developer has achieved something remarkable for themselves too, a wonderful springboard from which to elevate the rest of their work. And Stellar Blade does, in many ways, feel like the antithesis of current game development in the way it kind of came out of nowhere, with no real weight or anticipation behind it, and that in turn means I'm okay with this game just being perfectly good for me, at least as a player. It doesn't need to be anything more than it is. And in a sense, that's very refreshing. Refreshing in the same way that Stellar Blade itself is. In the same way, it feels like a AA PlayStation 2 era game, only with, of course, a coat of paint befitting of the current generation. Either way, this was a big hit for Shift Up, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do next and where the franchise goes. They've got the bones of a really successful series here, I think, in very strong core gameplay. Now, where and how you perform that gameplay simply needs to be made more interesting, and that sense of wonder discovered. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. I really do hope you enjoyed it so very much, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know down in the comments below, have you played Stellar Blade? If you have, what did you think? Do your thoughts line up with mine at all? And if not, let me know how you felt about the game, its worlds, its world building, its art direction, all of that sort of thing. Did Stellar Blade have a sense of wonder for you? Were you compelled to go and explore, to find the game's secrets? And when you did it feel worthwhile? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts about this game down in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to do so now to stay up to date with everything the channel is putting out, and to help us reach our next major milestone of 20,000 subs, which is a little ways off yet, but hey, we can be optimistic. Alright everyone, but once again, thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, we'll catch you later, and let's talk games again.